Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for visiting Ligamus this evening. I would like, first of all, to welcome our guests, Professors Basak, Alpan and Monnet. Let me say a few words about the project within which this public lecture is organized. Some of you basically are already familiar with this project, and I see some familiar faces who took part in different activities of the project. The name of the project is, the abbreviation of the project is LEAP, which is linking to Europe at the periphery. This is the project funded within the Monnet network of the European Commission, and the basic idea or the basic goal of the project is to link and to bring periphery and the center of the EU and the European Union with each other, to establish kind of the better linkages and better contacts between center and the periphery. The major idea of the project is to explore, based on various activities such as research component, which is really very intensive part of the whole project, and also some other activities, including the activities with the engagement of the students, is to explore how EU is understood, how EU is perceived, experienced, and taught in its periphery. And when we talk about periphery, in this case, we mean mostly use neighbors, and in this case, kind of the eastern neighborhood of EU, and we include partners from, besides Georgia, we include partners from Ukraine as well, and also the Balkans, and in this case, our partners from Kosovo, and also in periphery, we mean even new member states, but the non-member states, like Romania, and of course, the Turkey is important partner and the neighboring country of the EU. So basic idea of the project is to bring these different perspectives from different neighboring and peripheral countries, I would say, of EU, and to share these experiences and to see whether there are any differences or experiences regarding how these countries and different segments within these countries perceive, understand, and experience EU. One of the layers of this kind of different perspectives is to see, for example, how EU is experienced at the level of the young population of these countries, and I also see some of the faces of the students who took part in the focus groups devoted to this particular aspect of this of the research component of the LEAP, and also the experiences and the perceptions that political elites have regarding the EU. I think that Professor Basak, Alpan might add some few words about the project, so I will stop here. Just I would like to emphasize, underline that the project is already at its kind of the finish. By September, in the beginning of September, we have kind of the concluding events, including the postgraduate conference, which will be organized in Ankara, and basically our remaining kind of the parts of our activities will be announced at the project website. So anyone who will be interested to take part and to apply to this conference are more than welcome. So we will encourage our students or our kind of professors interested and researchers interested in taking part in this conference to apply and to provide their own perspective to the conference. Okay, I will stop here, but before I give floor to our colleagues, I want to give brief information about today's lectures. So Professor Basak Alpan will deliver. She is professor of Middle East Technical University in Ankara, Turkey, which is one of the leading universities in Turkey. She holds her PhD from the University of Birmingham, and her research interests are mostly focused on youth studies, Europeanization, Turkey relation. So from theoretical perspective, she also focuses on post-structuralist studies, and her publications are mostly focused around these topics which appear in leading academic journals and publications of the field. Here, today's lecture will mostly focus on the topic of migration crisis and the border security and border security narratives among Turkish political elites, and also how EU approaches the issue of the border security and how it influences EU-Turkey relationships. As for the second lecture, Dr. Milena Tongoda, who is director of the Center of European Studies at the National University of Political Science and Public Administration in Bucharest, in Bucharest, Romania. She at the, I even know the name of the department, so she's the she at the Department of Political Science and International Studies, or Public Administration, if I'm not mistaken. Her interests are also focused on EU studies, Europeanization, Western Balkans relations with EU, and her publications have appeared in many influential academic journals, in the peer-reviewed journals in the field. Her lecture today will focus on EU's policy towards accession of the new members, the lessons learned from the previous enlargements and how this impacts EU's enlargement policy today. And also her lecture will focus on the recent developments in Eastern neighborhood in the context of the ongoing Russia's war against Ukraine. And also just technical remark, after each lecture we will open floor for discussions and the questions and answers, and so you are welcome and you are encouraged to actively engage into the discussions. So thank you very much once again, and now I would like to give floor to Professor Alpan.
Thank you very much. Shall I start? Yeah. Thank you very much, and it's very nice to be here in Tbilisi. It's always nice to be here in Tbilisi. I mean, I know some of the faces from previous LEAP activities, because previously we had the LEAP EU simulation in Pristina, and here I see the best delegates of the simulation as well. So many thanks for joining us here, and I could also confirm, because in the morning we took a stroll together with Miruna, and I could say that the preparations for the Independence Day are going very well. So I could also confirm that. Today I will be presenting mainly on the narratives and practices in Turkish political landscape regarding the so-called migration crisis. So I will be mainly arguing that the developments in Turkish political landscape regarding the depiction of the migration crisis is a bit different than the EU counterpart, than the debates in the EU political scene, and I'll try to understand this from a securitization, desecuritization theoretical perspective. This is a quotation from Borisov from back in 2016, from the opening ceremony of European Border and Coast Guard. The mandate between, regarding the Turkish-Bulgarian border. From 2 years now, we have insisted that the external borders of Europe should be closed. Not the Bulgarian-Turkish border, not the Greek-Turkish border, not the Italian border, all borders. Because if we create the illusion that we have secured border here, they, the migrants, will cross across Finland. This short statement actually reflects the general spirit which became much more prevalent and which crystallized after the so-called migrant crisis of 2015. I don't really, I'm not a big fan of this term migration crisis or migrant crisis, because it wasn't the crisis of the migrants, right? It was actually the crisis of the host states, which couldn't really politically handle this problem, this influx of migrants, which started actually in 2011. So the migration crisis, if there's a crisis, it started back in 2011, not 2015. It has been depicted as a crisis by the EU Parliament because it started becoming physically affecting the EU countries. So that's why we kind of have to be a bit more critical of this term as well. So as we could understand from the statement, this recent developments regarding the, following the civil war in Syria led to a couple of policy responses on the part of the EU member states as well as the EU institutions as well. And they were mainly about border and border management. So the notion of border management became an issue as a hot topic in EU politics. It also had repercussions in the EU-Turkey relations as well. For instance, it led to a joint EU-Turkey action plan back in November 2015. And the better-known EU-Turkey deal back in March 2016, which kind of led to the return of the illegal migrants which crossed the Turkish-Greek border. Their return of the migrants to Turkey. So this was mainly heralded by Germany back then. The central argument of this presentation will be basically that the migration crisis initially pointed to a clash of the securitization moves of two parties, namely the EU and Turkey. If you're not familiar with this theoretical framework, so-called securitization, I will try to give some brief reference to it. But mainly securitization means that an issue is rendered a security issue and it's taken away from the daily flow of politics, but now it is something that has to do with the national security of the parties involved, right? So this is kind of a constructed, in a way, security perception by the political elites. But I will not bore you into tears with all the theoretical discussions, but we will be referring to them at a point. The EU, of course, and when I say the EU is not a monolithical entity, right? Different member countries have different political stances in terms of the Syrian migrants. But I'm now generalizing this, but of course we need to keep the nuances into consideration as well. The EU from the start securitized the influx of Syrian refugees, designating as a security problem. This is actually what I mean by the securitization concept at the narrative and practice level. And throughout, I think I also need to underline that throughout the presentation I will be making this differentiation between narratives and practices, because narratives are the narratives that we hear from political elites, whereas practices are not necessarily all the time coinciding what is told to us by the political elites. So I will be referring to narratives and practices separately. The Turkish side initially rather desecuritized the crisis. So from the start, the Syrian migrants started coming to Turkey after 2011. And from the start, this had never been a security issue. This had never been depicted as a security issue by the political elites. It had rather been depicted as a humane and moral liability and responsibility, right? A moral and ethical law. And there are some reasons for that. I will be getting into details of this is a political choice, but at the same time, migration is never seen as a threat to the ontological security of the Turkish state, right? There are other issues that are kind of seen as threats to the DNA, political DNA of the Turkish state, but migrants were not one of them. Migration was not one of them in the first place. But after 2016, it has been seen, it has started to be seen as a security problem due to more internal political developments in Turkish political scene. So Syrian refugees were never seen as a threat to the ontological security of the Turkish state and Turkish citizens, as it has frequently been the case in most of the EU member states. Nevertheless, this position has turned into a securitization of the crisis, especially after 2015 and 2016. 2016 is an important date for Turkish politics because it's in July 2016 there was a coup attempt, which kind of challenged the ontological security of the Turkish state, which was retaliated in a way. In terms of securitization of migration after this point. So this is the presentation plan. I mean, I could talk for ages, but feel free to interrupt me in case something is not clear. Okay. You didn't hear anything I said? Yeah. That's the presentation plan. I'll first talk about the shifts and continuities in migration policies and border management in Turkey. And then I will be referring to this theoretical background regarding securitization and desecuritization nexus. And finally, I will be giving more empirical details about the border management narratives and practices that were prevalent in Turkish political scene. So I guess if we need to be talking about migration in Turkey, the first thing would be that for Turkey, border control and migration have traditionally not been a priorities for the Schengen Europe, right? I mean, there are a couple of cultural and historical reasons for this. Because Turkey is a migrant country, I mean, it has been the recipient of migrants since the 15th century with the Sephardics, with the Circassians coming to Turkey in the 19th century. So migration had never been an issue of threat for Turkish, let's say, psyche, right? Contrarily, migration had been seen as an opportunity to enhance the influence, the state influence. For instance, this was one of the reasons why most of the, not most, but many Iranians had fled to Turkey when Khomeini regime was prevalent in Iran. So migration had been always seen as an opportunity to increase the soft power, the so-called soft power of the Turkish state. So since we are talking about 2010s, or let's say post-2000 period, there are two important, I would say, parameters which had a direct impact on the migration policy of Turkey. The first one is this aforementioned soft power approach to migration, that it is good to have migrants because this would kind of replicate the Turkish state influence, Turkish culture's influence, whatever, and the EU accession. Okay, even if the negotiations are physically or practically not working, I mean, Turkey is still on paper a candidate state, and this was, this EU impact was even much more intense when we speak about the context of 2000s. So when we look at the Turkish foreign policy in 2000s, we would see a focus on the regional activism, and we could actually understand this regional activism with reference to this migration perspective as well. So this foreign policy identity that Turkey tried to introduce was basically about a state. Turkey wanted to be a peace-promoting state in the region, bearing the capacity for instituting order, right? And this sounds very well, right? So everyone likes peace, but at the same time, this involves some references to Ottoman Empire times as well, because the region we're talking about is the ex-Ottoman territory, basically. So starting from early 2000s, we would hear very intense references to culture, to ideology, to language. Foreign students and migrants were the targets of this very soft power approach, because the more foreign students you have, at least this was the idea back in 2000, the more foreign students you have, the more cultural attraction you would, the more students you would culturally attract with this approach. So immigrants were a part of this picture, so it's never been problematic in this respect. I also said that the second important dynamic that has been prevalent in the 2000s was the EU conditionality, because when Turkey had been granted the EU candidacy back in 1999, Turkey had to synchronize its border management in line with the EU acquis, right? As a conditionality, as a part of the conditionality introduced with the Helsinki decision back in 1999. So at the same time, Turkey became the EU's external border in this respect, right? Even if it is not a member country, I mean, it had to synchronize its legislation in line with the EU acquis. And EU perspective regarding the migration was mainly focusing on a civilian approach in terms of migration. So institutions dealing with migration were converted, or were expected, were required to be more civilian. So that's the reason why we had institutions. Institutions were introduced, such as the Task Force for Asylum, Migration and External Borders Protection, 2002, the Director General of Migration Management, 2013, and the Disaster and Emergency Management Authority, back in 2009. So even the names of these institutions showed that the EU perspective expected the Turkish institutions dealing with migration to be civilian, and which kind of overlaps with Turkey's approach to soft power perspective, right? Because the more civilian you become, the more soft power role you might kind of assert. So this is, I mean, I just wanted to give some background information in this respect, and I also said in the beginning that I will be mostly referring to the theoretical framework regarding securitization and desecuritization. And securitization theory, I mean, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with anyway, but they had, I mean, the theoretical school, the so-called Copenhagen school, has basically been quite active back in the 1990s. And their main argument is basically that an issue becomes a security issue. Migration, energy, climate change, right? An issue, a political topic, right? This would make a good paper as well. If you are going to be writing on the papers, I mean, the securitization would be quite interesting to tackle with. So an issue becomes a security issue, not necessarily because it poses a real existential threat, but because it is presented as such by the political actors. So in the securitization move, we actually need three important components. We need a securitizing agent, a political party leader, let's say. We need a topic, right? We need a reference object, climate change, migrants, whatever, and we need an audience to basically convince. You need to tell the audience that, guys, you need to be careful about migrants because they're going to be taking our jobs, right? So this is a very caricaturized version of making a very cultural thing or social thing only a security issue. So when Copenhagen School started talking about securitization, migration was also a part of this very conceptual framework. So the field of migration from the start became a significant focus of the securitization studies, which later on has been followed by another interesting concept called desecuritization. Right? Desecuritization basically means that an issue which was securitized before is now taken away from the field of security and is again rendered something that has to do with the daily politics. The shifting of issues out of the emergency mode, basically, right, and into the normal bargaining processes of the political sphere, right. But a later intervention in desecuritization studies also says, argues that an issue might be desecuritized, or an issue might be the matter of desecuritization when it is securitized elsewhere. And migration could be a very good example to this, right? If migration is securitized all over the world, but it is not a security issue in Turkey, this might count as a desecuritized version of it, right? Because in, let's say, some political parties in Europe say that migration is a security issue, we need to be careful, etc. But in Turkey, it is something that has to do with the moral responsibilities, right? It is not necessarily because Turks are much moral than the Europeans, but this was the way in which it has been depicted in this way politically. So my claim in this respect is basically that the securitization could aim at presenting a particular issue in a particular non-security context, whereas the very issue is constantly being securitized elsewhere by other actors. So I promise this is the last overly theoretical claim I will be sharing with you, but I just have to earn my chest because this is how I will look at the migration issue in Turkey. So how could we make sense of this so-called of this migration crisis as reframed by some of the EU countries and Turkey? So if we just take a look at the EU side, I think it's fair to say that the crux of the EU response to migration after the end of the Cold War was basically about controlling it, right? A discourse on borders and migration governance and using humanitarian justifications for securitization, right? It is a security issue because we would like to secure our own citizens, right? And here it also goes hand in hand with the knowledge power relation as well. We need to control the migrants because we need to know more about them. We need to have their fingerprints. We need to know where they are coming from, what is their motivation, etc. And this is a trend after the end of the Cold War, but the pinnacle, I mean, a very important milestone is, of course, the year of 2015. After the Syrian war, I mean, there was an influx of Syrian refugees and immigrants to European shores, and this kind of rang the alarm bells for this migration perspective. After that, many things have been, many different policies have been crafted. Operation Sophia and the development of a European Border and Coast Guard agency emerged as the military actions by the EU to combat migration. I'm always referring to the EU as a monolithic entity, which is not. Of course, we could be speaking for ages about the reaction of individual states, but I think we would all agree that it has been an important resource for populist parties. Because it is always easier to put the blame on someone else who is coming from a different country. So the association of migrants with criminal activities was something which has been very often used by the political parties. I also looked at the EU Parliament documents as well. That time, the EU Committee of the House of Lords was, this was before basically Brexit, but as the EU borders become more challenging to navigate, migrants will be more likely to turn to smugglers to facilitate their illegal crossings. And we also had many different political parties like Alternative for Germany, like the UKIP in the UK, which kind of, or Finnish the People's Party, which kind of made migration an issue to be protected from, right? So it was quite a resource for populist and far-right parties as well. But the things at the Turkish front was a bit different, because following the escalation of the domestic conflicts in Syria, the AKP government declared an open-door policy toward the Syrian refugees back in October 2011. Accordingly, Turkey allowed Syrians with passports to enter the country freely and treated those who had entered without documents in a similar way. Because the expectation was that the war will end soon, and there will be a couple of, I mean, the Syrian migrants who had been accepted will return back to their houses, to their homes, and the way in which, especially the AKP government, Justice and Development Party, referred to this issue was basically it's a religious and historical responsibility to provide refuge to the Syrian refugees. There were also very intense religious references as well, like Ansar Spirit. Ansar is a religious term which is used for taking good care of the migrants and visitors. So the assistance of the state was kind of legitimized in this way. This is a humanitarian crisis. The assistance of the state to the refugees is accomplished based on charity, but I mean here we also have to say that, okay, this is perhaps a moral issue, but this perspective on the part of the state institutions was based on a charity perspective. It wasn't based on universal human rights. This was only because, you know, these people are in a bad condition, so we have to do it out of moral issues. Rather than universally recognized rights that are supposed to be granted to refugees fleeing their homelands, I mean, in international law, this is already a right granted to the refugees, but in Turkish politics, it has been depicted as a charity move, as something, because we are very good-hearted and we are very good-spirited, that's what we are doing. The institutional structure of the Turkish border management has also provided a conducive framework for the desecuritization of border practices from the start, because as I've already said, they were mainly organized around civilian provisions. So when the migration crisis started, the migration crisis was desecuritized in Turkish politics, both at the narrative level. They need this, they are in a bad situation, we need to do this out of humanitarian reasons, and at the practice level. I mean, an open door policy without, from the start, not even registering most of the Syrian refugees, etc. But this lasted up until 2016, which is a turning point, because after 2016, well, it started in 2015 actually, when the Turkish elections back in June 2015 and snap elections in November 2015, the Erdogan government kind of felt that, okay, I mean, there might be a opportunity, I mean, we might be losing the elections, so there was kind of an over-securitization of the whole political atmosphere. And it was also coincided with so many ISIS attacks, and PKK attacks in Turkey to the civilians. So the time period between 2015 and 2016, especially the coup attempt in July 2016, it witnessed a very high degree of securitization in the whole Turkish political scene. It even introduced an emergency regime for some time, especially after the coup attempt. So after 2016, it increasingly became untenable to resort to the soft power approach, because power was not soft anymore. It really came with the emergency regimes, it came with the tanks, with the police, etc. Right? So the wholesale securitization of this power, soft power approach. So it was intertwined with the revision of this open door policy toward one based on temporary protection after 2016. The discourse on migrants were rather that, okay, we kind of accepted them, but now they have to go back, right? Or the EU countries or EU institutions should share our burden, right? So the discourse started to change. But still, at a narrative level, we didn't hear anything from the political elites that the migrants are a part of the security discourse. They are the threats to Turkish state, whatever. After, for instance, July 2016 coup attempt, there are so many statements on the grounds that open door policy towards the immigrants will not be revived. They are still welcome at the narrative level. But at the practice level, we see a completely different picture. Because there has been a very highly securitized border between, physical border between Syria and Turkey after 2016. And what we hear from the officials working in field of migration is basically like this. This is from an interview by one official working in the migration and asylum field. Day-to-day jobs since 2016 involved providing security background checks and sensitive border crossing analysis. But this wasn't the case before 2016, right? For instance, in May 2017, Aselsan, which is like the state-owned military company, was awarded the contract for the supply of the armored and unarmored mobile surveillance units for border control, and actually through the funds that had been received from the EU, IPA funds. Aselsan, this factory that I mentioned, also built a border security system at Turkey's border with Syria. It included the so-called smart military towers with observation and obstruction systems. So after 2016, even if there wasn't a securitization at the narrative level, the migrants were still not depicted as a threat. At the practice level, everything was completely different. There were high walls, razor wires. I mean, you could physically see that there is a border, very high and impermeable border between Turkey and Syria. So, in this respect, after 2016, there hasn't been a salient shift in terms of securitizing narratives, which target the Syrian refugees. But the focus was rather about a resentment towards the United Nations and EU authorities. This is a quotation from Erdogan, President Erdogan. We do not have the word idiot on our forehead. I think this was back in 2017. We already had the people returning from Edirne, the European border of Turkey. This will repeat only once or twice. We can open the gates and tell them goodbye. So, increasingly, the migrants started to be used as a bargaining chip between Turkey and the EU. And March 2016, EU-Turkey refugee deal is the epitome of this bargaining anyway. The reasoning here was mainly economic, that the jobs should be given to the Turks, not the Syrians. I'm putting it very vulgarly. And the focus was basically on returning back to their homeland, to Syria, basically. So, as a conclusion, I basically could say that unlike the cases in most of the EU member states, where the migration crisis had been securitized from the start, the Turkish side rather desecuritized the crisis, seeing the deal as a moral and ethical move and blamed the EU for not sharing the burden or getting away from its core values and principles. However, in European politics, securitization of migration was rather the glue cementing most of the far-right populist parties in their anti-immigrant discourses and policies. In Turkey, both the incumbent and opposition parties have used the refugee card. Of course, refugee card was, the migration was used as a political discourse, but usually to appeal to the growing social, economic, and cultural grievances of their voters, but in a rather selective manner, right? So it had never been taken away from the daily flow of politics, but it has been included within the flow of politics. In this respect, I think we also need to refer to this notion of ontological security, because migrants, as I've already said, are not seen as, or migration is not seen as a complete threat to the ontological security of the Turkish state, but everything changed after 2016 because Turkey increasingly started feeling itself insecure towards the, let's say, aliens and threats. So, what is happening today? I would say that the issue has still not been included in the elements that determine politics in Turkey. But I would say there is an everyday securitization of migration. So people from the bottom, what is happening in daily life, people are not really increasingly airing their grievances with the migrants. We hear things from schools where the Syrian kids are going. We see street clashes, tiny clashes. But so even if the political parties are not securitizing to a full extent the migration issue, there is kind of a bottom-up grievance, which will at a point find its resonance. Actually, we see in the very recent presidential election campaign that some political leaders are actually using this refugee card for the first time since 2011, to say that if we come to power, we will be sending 10 million refugees. The figures are changing every day. I say 10 million, they say 13. Yeah, exactly. But for the first time, the Syrian refugees are becoming a political issue in the very recent presidential election campaign, which basically means that the bottom-up securitization of migration is finding its resonance in the daily politics. So thanks very much for bearing with me, and I will be happy to answer your questions in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.